This is the Subjective Professor Podcast, episode 13. And in this episode, we're going to talk about white privilege. I'm going to give away the ending right now. Yes, white privilege is real. However, there is also such a thing as black privilege, yellow privilege, brown privilege, etc. So we're going to talk about what privilege is as understood by the current academic discourse. We're going to talk about the problems that generally are not discussed with this discourse of white privilege. And then we're going to talk about the problems in terms of specificity and being too broad. And then we're going to try to talk about how to sort of get out of this funk of talking about only whiteness. All right. So first of all, privilege. It's an unearned advantage. That's how most people will start off by describing it. That privilege is an unearned advantage. You did nothing to get it. You were born with it, and there it is. The standard uh, beliefs surrounding white privilege in this discourse is that the perks, you have perks for being white that other people don't have. And in order to compete with you, to stay up with you, to be as successful as you, they have to work a lot harder. Um, Now, if privilege is real, then we can't have meritocracy, right? We can't have a government by merit. We can't have society sort of come to order, arrive at a state of order just by virtue of your merits, right? So if you work hard, then you get rewarded. If you study well, then you'll get a better grade. That's meritocracy. But uh, add to this white privilege, then white people don't have to work as hard. They don't have to study as hard. They don't have to plan or prepare as much as other people because they're white. It also is said that people who enjoy a privilege, they deny its existence. So if you were to go to a white person and you say, hey, you're successful because you have white privilege, the reply will generally be something along the lines of, what are you talking about? I worked hard for what I have. And then the response to that would be, oh, you're denying its existence because you enjoy it, right? You're benefiting from it, and so therefore you deny its existence. It's very similar to an accusation of hypocrisy, if it isn't. Um, and also, finally, having privilege conveys power and authority over others. These are the four things, basically, that are generally more or less said within the discourse of white privilege. Over time, I believe, because you don't hear about white privilege anymore, all you hear about is white supremacy. So you allow an idea to stew in a narrow subjectivity for long enough, it will become toxic, right? And so the idea of white privilege has sort of morphed into this idea of white supremacy. They are very, very similar. You read the discourse, and it's just the the um, the the language and the emotion behind the writing has just gotten a lot more intense. All right. But if you examine closely those writings on white privilege, I'll just use white privilege as because well, that's all really people are talking about. People have a hard time describing whiteness. Like, what's white? What is it to be white? And you'll know that a lot of people will point to certain behaviors and say, "Oh, you're trying to act white," right? You'll see this in the inner city when certain African Americans or certain non-whites are behaving in a certain way. People will have all kinds of names for them: Oreo, black on the outside, white on the inside; banana, yellow on the outside, white on the inside, right? So people who are trying to act white, be white, when they're not actually white. But what are those things? People have a hard time explaining or even describing what whiteness is. Or maybe they're afraid to describe what they think whiteness is. So instead of talking about whiteness as such, they're going to just give examples of whiteness, right? So if you're doing this, see, that's white. But this is a Socratic problem. We talked about this earlier, one of the earlier episodes where Socrates is constantly trying to come up with a good example, good definition. But usually his dialogue partner cannot provide him or give him a good definition for the topic or the construct that they are discussing. So, for example, people will, I'll ask people, so is eating hamburgers, is that a white thing? Is loving NASCAR, is that, auto racing, is that a white thing? Is country music a white thing? If is self-hate a white thing? And so people have a hard time because they can always hear and imagine non-whites eating hamburgers, non-whites enjoying NASCAR or cars in general, and country music as well. So that becomes a problem. So people just sort of, especially the experts, will just sort of laugh it off and say, "Oh, you know what I mean. You're just trying to give me a hard time." No, I'm doing the Socrates thing. I'm trying to get a definition of whiteness. So I'm going to give you a definition of whiteness, right? All white is a categorization, a generalization, with white being the operative identifiable characteristic. So if you go back a couple of episodes when I talk about and go over what race actually is, then it's just a generalization using a specific identifiable physical characteristic, right? So that's what white is. Anyone who could be seen as white, you're going to say, "Oh, you're white," and apparently because they are white, they have privileges. Unless you start doing a little bit more digging, right? So, for example, white immigrants who can't speak English, do they have the same kind of privilege? Maybe. Russians, they're white, right? So you can kind of see that there's this intense, a large diversity within whiteness, but we're just going to sort of flatten that all out and say, no, no, no. It doesn't matter all the other characteristics that you might have. The whiteness is all that matters. And then, of course, you have to think about the poor white people in Appalachia or the Southeast, right? I don't know about now if things have changed, but the South Side of Boston, apparently, the Irish there, they're called Southies. Ben Affleck and Jason Bourne guy, Matt Damon, they're from there, and they always talk about, or at least they used to talk about how rough it was, right? They're white, but not like other whites, right? So there are a lot of exceptions. There are a lot of examples of white people who don't really seem to enjoy the kind of white privilege that people want to ascribe them. So I'll even say something in class. I'll say, "Oh yeah, so white students, they don't have to study for exams. They don't have to prepare for job interviews, right? Because they're white, right? Like they're never victims of violent crimes either because they're white." So, in other words, to go all in on white privilege seriously, I mean, to do it seriously requires ignoring exceptions, the minorities within the broad category of white. And so you're going to go along with the narrative, with what people say, rather than the actual data. There's also a problem with conflation of racializations, right? So, and you may have already sensed it, but is the ability to take a test well, to memorize quickly, uh, athletic ability, is that tied to your skin color, or is that something entirely different? And that's where people begin to hopefully see that whiteness is just simply a skin color. It doesn't say anything about your maturity, your athletic ability, how good you are at math, how good you are at grammar. It doesn't say anything about any of those other racializations. And so this is why you avoid any kind of detailed analysis of what whiteness may or may not be. You allow it to be vague in the broadest sense. But if you continue and to push this white privilege idea, then are Black people successful because they are white, right? They act white. Are Japanese car companies, when Japanese car companies nearly bankrupted all the American car companies back in the 70s, did they do that by being more white than white people? And you see, it gets kind of absurd very, very quickly, right? So And some people might even say the ways of whiteness, or, to the Japanese, I'm sure if you ask them, they will not say they're trying to be white, rather they're being very Japanese, right? All right, so the problem of the white privilege discourse is too broad and too specific at the same time. So it's too broad because it fails to see the individual and how the individual overcomes obstacles that might appear and come up in their path. So it ignores your achievements in your specific life, in your individual life. Also, when we've talked about this already, it conflates other positive things with whiteness. And so, in other words, you ignore other privileges that you may have. Yes, other privileges, because white privilege is not the only privilege out there. There are many others. And yes, there is such a thing as Black privilege. Also, let's keep in mind that white privilege fails in other contexts, right? So whites in Asia, for example, it means nothing if you can't speak the language, if you have no job skills, if you have no education. I mean, what do you have to offer? You can't just go there and say, hey, look, I'm white, maybe as a circus act, right? For people who've never seen a white person, wow, this is just might be kind of interesting. Also, being white is a disadvantage in certain circles, right? So Eminem was a white rapper. We're going to skip over Vanilla Ice, right? But Eminem was a white rapper, and he caught a lot of shade, if you will, kind of negative publicity for being white. And so in certain fields of life, you'll see that whiteness is not actually an advantage, but actually is a disadvantage. So with that understanding and building on what we had said earlier in earlier episodes, legislation does not help to eradicate white privilege because, as I said, it's not really what people think it is. So legislation becomes protection for white privilege. Whatever people think white privilege is, if you legislate against it, then whatever behavior you are identifying with whiteness, you're protecting it, right? So instead of trying to reduce it, to get rid of it, to penalize it, you're actually protecting it. We already went over various examples in previous episodes. I did a restaurant example, like if you say whites only, what happens? The Rosa Parks situation with the buses, the Flexner report and medical schools and hospitals. So we have already a lot of examples and we're running out of time, so I won't go over them again. So instead of allowing people who live in society, who live and make choices, allowing them to decide by their choices what is acceptable and what is not. The government comes in and decides who are the winners by codifying the business model or codifying the methods, but just adding on, but you can't discriminate against non-whites, right? And so, in other words, instead of the business being punished and reforming on their own, which would happen when people stop buying their stuff or going there using whatever it is that they are responsible for. Instead of that, no, they stay in business, but rather other businesses now have to conform to the way they do things, which is protectionism, basically. We started getting into the specific, but to talk about it more in a focused way, white privilege is not the only privilege that exists. Now, remember what I said. All race is a generalization based on a single trait, identifiable trait. And you can do this with pretty much anything that can be generalized. This means, if we were to continue consistently, that every racialization has its privileged and not so privileged, right? So not everyone who's white is going to seem to be have an easier life than everybody else, right? Every racialization, you're going to see this, right? It's not simply because you're Black that you're just going to have a crap life. That's not how it works. But rather, every racialization, every category that you could be put into has its privileged and it's not privileged. So yes, there is Black privilege, but we have to unwind and separate all of the different racializations, right? So athletic ability is not tied to your skin color. Let's get that straight. So being successful in sport is because you have that racialization. You're great at baseball, like Jackie Robinson, right? So in other words, Jackie Robinson, was he great at baseball because he was black? That's kind of an absurd argument if you put it that way, because then it means that all black uh, baseball players are as good as Jackie Robinson, and that just simply is not the case. So what is black privilege, right? I had a black student once ask me, like, she was African American, and she was just like, there's no such thing as black privilege. And I'm like, you mean no one is attracted to you, right? Black privilege means people who are attracted, who see blackness as the all be all end all of everything, right? So instead of catering to someone who's white, you can't even see white. All you see is African Americans. Remember, I said that there are some people, especially when it comes to close personal relationships, some people will say, "I don't see color." Right, but especially in the context of marriage or long-term relationships. But I don't think it's that. I think it's rather that they only see a certain color, right? They're attracted to a certain kind of person. But it's weird to say that, like, oh, I'm fixated on Asians, right? It becomes a weird thing, I guess, depending on the context, where you are, right? And so instead of saying that, you just simply say, I'm not, color isn't a big deal for me. But see, that's the privilege, right? So if you were someone who wanted to get together with someone, but you were the wrong color, well, see, you don't have that privilege. So it's not so much white privilege, which should be the focus of discussion, but rather, what is your privilege? What are the set of privilege, right? So how do you use the privileges that you have? Because we all have it, at least one, probably two, several, right? So how do you use them? What are they? Right? That seems to be more important. That's what seems to matter more. So the discovering what your privileges are, having the creativity to be able to utilize the various privileges that you have in such a way that you can be successful, right? And so we have to ask, what am I good at? Instead of looking at other people and saying, I wish I had what they had. No, why don't you start looking at yourself and saying, what do I bring to the table? What do I have that other people don't have? And so and it's up to you and your choice. So allow people to explore, and then in this process, we foster a climate where people seek out others for their specific abilities. We already talked about Jackie Robinson, and we'll get into this more when we talk about institutional racism, but we see this everywhere already, right? People who have an idea of the kind of person they want working for them or to be with, to spend time with, and then they look for those characteristics. So to focus on white privilege promotes and protects it, and that's what we said. And it's mostly because of the conflation of other racializations with whiteness. Okay, that's it for this episode. I'll see you in the next one where we talk about institutional racism.